Thank you for listening to Inspired and Admired.
All right, and welcome to Inspired and Admired. My name is Matt Truman. This is episode number 23. Today I want to talk about a guy named William Alexander Morgan. Maybe you've heard of him, maybe you haven't. I thought this would be a good story to come out of the Huber Heights Candidate Series, something different, something to bring you back in and so we can get back to where we were here on Inspired and Admired. William Alexander Morgan was a guy who he was born and raised in Ohio. He was born in Cleveland, Ohio, raised in Toledo, Ohio. The story goes that, after a stint in the Army and dropping out of high school, and then going in the Army, that he got fascinated with the revolution that was happening during the 50s over in Cuba. So he linked up with some fellas and went to Cuba to fight in the revolution over there in the 50s, and then ran and joined with the Cubans. And then he rose to the rank of Comandante, which is, he was the second in command of his outfit there in the Escambray Mountains. So we're going to talk about this guy, and what happened to him in the end is quite interesting as well. So here we go. So who was William Morgan? Throughout this podcast, we're going to talk about who William Morgan was, what he did, and how it put its mark on history. So, who was William Morgan? William Morgan was a rambunctious kid growing up. I'm sure he gave his mother and father quite a bit of trouble. His father actually took him to the circus, and he was so fascinated with it that he ran away to the circus, and his parents had to go retrieve him back from the circus when he was around, I believe it was 15 years old. So later on, William Morgan would drop out of high school, and then he would join the Army. And while he was in the Army, he would be stationed in Japan. In Japan, he got into a little trouble. He also married a Japanese-German wife in Japan. But in Japan, he would run away. I believe he ran away with her. Then he would get into a little trouble because he was AWOL at this point. So the MPs finally caught up with him. They brought him back to the brig. And while in the brig, he must have planned an escape because he ended up overpowering the guards and escaping from the brig. Once they finally caught up with him, they brought him back and conducted a court-martial. So he ended up being discharged dishonorably. So he left the Army at this point. And after leaving the Army, he ended up joining the circus because he was obviously fascinated with it. So when he went to the circus, he learned how to throw knives, and he dressed as a clown and things like that. He would eventually make his way down to Miami, Florida. In Miami, he worked as a bouncer and a clown, and he got to know a lot of the expat Cubans down there. So he would talk with them, tell them stories. They would tell him stories about Cuba, and they would often talk politics, Cuban politics. So they inspired him enough with their stories of Cuba that he actually made friends with a few and talked them into letting him go down to Cuba and help them fight. So in 1957, he joined up with a group called the Second National Front of Escambray. They were opposed to Fulgencio Batista, who was at the time the dictator of Cuba and had a lot of involvement with the mafia, allowing them to run casinos, and they were definitely pro-American government, but at the same time, it was a dictatorship. There weren't open elections and things like that that we know of today. So Morgan makes his way down to Cuba, to the Escambray Mountains. So if you're thinking in your mind right now of what Cuba looks like, it's just in the middle. The Escambray Mountains were in the middle. So that is where the Second National Front would be. And then you have Havana, where Batista is in control. And then you have down further at the far end of Cuba, that's where Fidel Castro and the 29th of July movement, that's where they were commanding their part of the resistance. And just to go back a little bit, so when Morgan was discharged from the army dishonorably, he actually spent 2 years in prison for that. Then that's when he left and joined the circus. So I wanted to go back and explain that a little bit. Let's see here. So, at first, the Cuban revolutionaries did not think highly of William Morgan coming down there and fighting. They allowed it, obviously, but they gave him a lot of crap for doing it. So the first few days, they really bit into him and made him do some menial tasks, but he stuck through it. Even though it was tough and it was hard, this was something that he felt in his heart that needed to be done. So he stuck through it. He battled through all that. And not only that, he fought in some battles with the group, the Second National Front of Escambray, that he rose to be second in command as Comandante of that organization. So he was a proven soldier with those revolutionaries after a while. So at this point, some of you may wonder, why was an American down there fighting? Well, the New York Times in 1958, they did an article, and you can search this on the interwebs. But he wrote, in part, "I am here because I believe that the most important thing for free men to do is to protect the freedom of others. I am here so that my son, when he is grown, will not have to fight or die in a land not his own, because one man or group of men try to take his liberty from him. I am here because I believe that free men should take up arms and stand together, fight and destroy the groups of forces that want to take the rights of people away." That's what William Morgan said. And it brings me to current time when I think about some of the Americans and the Brits that go over to Syria or Iraq now. They go over and they link up with the Kurds and they fight. They're fighting against the Islamic State because they're fighting for the freedom. That's the type of guy that William Morgan was. As we get through this, we'll find out that, he wasn't, was he a perfect person? No, I don't want that impression, but he wasn't one who agreed with communism and the beliefs that Castro later on took. So at this point, he believes, that they're fighting for the freedom because a lot of the students, he was part of a student group, / now we're revolutionaries, that believed in freedom and free elections and giving the power of the government back to the people. Something that I think many of us listening, and myself included, believe that freedom is of importance as we see ourselves with a government. I mean, there has to be a government, right? But the question is, how much control should the government have? Anyway, I'm getting off on a tangent, and I like to do that. So back to the story of William Morgan. So, in that same year, 1958, this fella Che Guevara, you folks might see these T-shirts running around with these college kids or whatever wearing the Che Guevara T-shirts. Well, Che Guevara was a Marxist. Okay, so anybody wearing those T-shirts, you probably want to research Che Guevara a little better. Anywho, Che Guevara come down from where Castro was set up, at the farther end of Cuba. And he was Castro's Comandante, his second in command. So Castro sent Che Guevara to link up with Morgan's group. And at first they took Guevara by force. Guevara was an Argentine guy who came up from South America over there to help this revolution. There's a movie out there about him. Benicio del Toro plays Che Guevara. It's pretty interesting. Anywho, so Che Guevara comes down into the Escambray Mountains. He talks with the group and ends up convincing them to join forces. Two armies are better than one. And it ended up they were right. But the Second National Front, I'm not sure, needed Che Guevara's help, but Che Guevara and Fidel Castro needed their help to bring them in because they ultimately wanted control. That's what ends up happening. Anyway, the group, they join forces, and then they fight a few battles, and then they end up taking the town of Santa Clara in December of 1957. 12 hours. Well, it wasn't 12 hours after that Batista fled Cuba. So there were some battles and some things in between all that. But after they joined forces, they take Santa Clara, and then Batista says, I have lost this war. I need to get out. So then Fidel Castro comes out. He ends up taking control, and he explains to the Cuban people, okay, so we won this. We are the revolutionaries. We won this. We took back Cuba. This is great. Soon we'll have free elections, and then, everything will be great. As we all know now, that never happened. Something that happened in 1959, something that's very relevant to the story. Dominican Republic President Rafael Trujillo. This guy was a brutal dictator, but he was an American-backed dictator, much like Batista. He sent some fellas to go see William Morgan. And I believe they linked up somewhere, maybe Miami, perhaps. So, anywho, they linked up with this President Trujillo from the Dominican Republic, and Morgan linked up. They tried to coerce Morgan because he was a freedom-loving American, William Morgan, and they tried to get him to assassinate or come up with a plan to assassinate or overthrow Castro. So during this plan, William Morgan, at the time, believed that Castro was a capitalist and Castro was going to set up free elections and everything, so he was still on the side of Castro. Castro built up, very charismatic leader, very charismatic speaker. Castro was, in fact, a bright person, a lawyer in Cuba. Che Guevara was actually a physician, a doctor in Venezuela, or not Venezuela, Argentina. I apologize to anyone from Venezuela or Argentina for making that terrible mistake. I don't know. This should be a story about just you and I, whoever's listening. We're just kicking back, drinking a beer, and I'm telling you the story about William Morgan. I don't know. Anywho, so Trujillo was planning this assassination of Fidel Castro so that they could get back Cuba to where it was of their liking. And William Morgan, being the American, the Americans and CIA and all those folks thought that he would be into it. Well, he wasn't. He went back to Castro and let him know the plan and told him, listen, there's some folks that want to get you. So they devised this plan to create a diversion, a fake, if you will, war. And that's exactly what they did. So they offered Morgan during this time, they offered Morgan $500,000 to take part in this overthrow of Castro's new reign. And like I said, he went along with it. And he went back to Castro, and they devised this fake war. And during that time, Castro had a plan. They would